Hi, everyone. I'm Rabbi Michael Birnholz. I'm at Temple Beth Shalom in Vero Beach. And I have been doing garden projects really since I've been a child. I've always loved playing in the garden. It's one of the things that I remember about my grandfather in Dallas, and also doing as a experience with my mom in Jackson, Mississippi, and then later in Tampa. My parents actually just retired a little over a year ago, and that's what they do. They actually play in their yard, and that's what my wife and I do with a lot of our leisure time activities. Just something we've always had a passion and an interest in. A number of years ago, I was researching and found that anywhere you can grow oranges, that you can grow olives. So I started wondering if we could make olive oil. And then in a conversation where we realized, wait, if we can grow oranges, maybe we can grow etrogim, and so then that became etrog trees. And then the next thing you know is we have a biblical garden and all kinds of plantings here at our synagogue that help us. And we do two things with the garden projects at our synagogue. We like to, one, use the garden to teach Jewish values, and then the Jewish values of taking care of the earth. And so what I'm going to offer to you today is a number of different Jewish concept gardens. And my goal of doing this is to give you a little bit more kavanah, a little more intention, creativity, something to not just say, my synagogue, we want to plant a garden, but give you more of a story, more of a framework, more of, wait, what are we planting? What are we going to do with it? And how is it going to be part of our Jewish community? And I say that, and whether it's a synagogue, whether it's a Jewish school, whether it's a JCC, whether it's your own house, any of these things can be used and applied. They're just a good way of giving some structure and giving some focus and direction. And we're Jews. Everything we do has to do with story. And the more story we tell, sometimes the more fun it is. I remember watching an episode of Chopped, the show on Food Network. And there they are in the midst of this competition, and one of the chefs, he made a mistake. He forgot salt or seasoning, and the judges asked him about it, and he then starts spinning this tale of why he couldn't have the seasoning in. And then it happened again, and by the second round, I'm like, okay, who is this guy? This is a Jewish way that he's approaching it, with everything had to be a story. And sure enough, he was an Israeli chef, or had a very Israeli Hebrew name. And I was like, how did I hear the way that he told a story as a way of explaining himself, and just know that in my bones that was a very Jewish thing to do. So that's what I'm going to share with you, that I'm offering to you a number of different Jewish ways to take Jewish story and plant it in your garden. So I am now doing a screen share with you will take you through some of these Jewish concept gardens. I will have available a listing after the webinar of some of the different things I'm throwing out. I have a longer text, but I worry that if I throw too many words out, it just gets to be a jumble of everything. And I'm happy to do all sorts of different pieces. I'm going to give you a little taste of some of the things that I do, and I'm going to show you both width and depth. Now, the other piece I wanted to come back to, as Deb was introducing me, is soil, and why soil and carbon, because very often I think people don't garden because they're like, well, wait, what am I supposed to grow? My hope here is to give people, again, that focus of what do I want to plant, and maybe give them yet another reason to go out in the garden, whether it's intergenerationally, whether it's themselves, whether it's at the synagogue or a Jewish community or at home, to give people reason to plant and a focus for planting that might get more gardens or more plantings happening. So I am assuming that everyone is able to see my projection and that we are good to go. So I call this Jewish concept gardens. There's a bunch of different values behind it. One is food appreciation. You'll hear me talk about this in a few different of the gardens I do, but how do we measure or think about how much effort it takes to grow the food that we eat? You'll hear me talk about it with the chicken soup garden, or with the pear garden, or with the matzah and kitniyot garden. I've tried to grow a few different times to see how much wheat you have to grow in order to make one slice of bread. As I say that, I have never been successful. I've grown wheat. You'll see some pictures later. But right when I'm about to pick it, the squirrels come and get it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one of the things. I was in, I think it was 2014, I was on the front page of the Wall Street Journal for all of my biblical gardening failures. I am not afraid to fail. I keep trying this stuff. Sometimes it actually works, which is mind-blowing to me. But that's one of these things, is not to be afraid, just to experiment, to play. The more we do, the more you learn, and the more you experience. And that's a huge part of this as well. So food appreciation, can we measure the efforts to supply what we eat? Ritual, I do a lot of planting of produce that I want to use, that I can use at home or in our synagogue for ritual, whether it's groggers, whether it's cotton that I grow for olive oil lamps for Shabbat, to tell a story. So what are the foods that our ancestors are eating when they had a moment of challenge or connection? You'll see in here that I have a lentil soup garden. Can we grow lentils or some of the herbs or spices you might make in lentil soup? I'm of course referring to this story of Jacob and Esau when Jacob ends up getting the birthright for a pot of red stuff. To connect to our history, what are the mechanics of growing, or the produce we have that we experience a sliver of what our ancestors have? I'll talk about karpas and maror. When we talk about the bitter herbs and sweet herbs of Passover, we're talking about what they would have had in Egypt, what they grow in the land of Israel, what, if you're Ashkenazic or Sephardic, what your Ashkenazic or Sephardic ancestors would have had in Europe, or what we have in our own markets here. And then finally, to illustrate a value, can we see Kedusha, or holiness, in the garden? Here's an example. What are the values or experiences of a growing vine? And so if we take a young person out and you show them a vine growing in, is it a vine that needs a trellis? Is it a vine that has wide arms going out? There's all sorts of language of the people of Israel being a vine going out. How do we start to take what we see in the garden and use that as a way of teaching and connecting people to what's happening in the garden? This picture here, you might see a flower. I'm hoping you see a flower. That's the stem. Here's the center. Here are the petals. This is one of our pollinator gardens. That we actually design the garden in a shape so that as people are looking at it, they're seeing this shape, and then it's like Passover. Why is this night different from all other nights? That we then get a chance to tell the story. Some of the pictures you'll see actually today have the shape of the flower. It's kind of lost it as the plants have grown. And that's one of the other things, is we're talking about living gardens. And as I often say, the farmer plans and then the kids plant. So in a lot of these gardens, I have great plans, and I always get to use them. Sometimes they don't go according to plan. Mantracht und Godlacht. So this is actually our pollinator garden. So you can actually see here are the petals. Excuse me. Here are the petals that we planted. You can see I just used some bricks to start to build it up. We filled it with soil. You can see these now. This is now overgrown with black aster, and I've got some fire spike back here now. Actually the aster has taken over 2 of the different petals. Stuff has really been growing. One note, I live in Florida. I live on the east coast of Florida. My growing season starts in January and ends in December, with a little hiatus in July. I pretty much grow all year here, but I live in Florida, which is lovely in a lot of ways, and very weird because in other places you don't have that same growing season. At least that's the rumor that I hear. So I'm going to show you what I do in my garden that I hope you can take and apply to your garden experience. But every place has a different climate and a different growing culture. And so my hope is to give you Jewish concept gardens so that you can do what works in your space. I was up at a summer camp, the URJ 6 Points Creative Arts Academy last summer. Milkweed in Pennsylvania does not look like milkweed in Florida, just a completely different looking plant. And so that's part of the experience of this, is what can we learn from each other and share with each other. I did see it growing in the garden in Pennsylvania, a plant called Job's Tears, which is in the corn family, and I've been able to plant it here. So So the plants don't necessarily apply. It's the values and the concepts and the constructs that I hope that I can share with you. So this is our pollinator garden, and the pollinator garden has two goals. One is that goal is to make sure pollinators have healthy places. So I am hoping that with my garden, with these gardens, to bring pollinators, because pollinators are key. Here's a little piece of an article. Over half of the diets of fats and oils comes from crops pollinated by animals. They facilitate the production of 90% of the world's flowering plants. If we don't have pollinators, we have a serious environmental problem. With a pollinator garden, you plant plants that draw pollinators to your area. We've seen it at our house. 2 years ago, my wife and I moved into a new house with our kids. We planted a pollinator garden, and the number of birds that we now see has shot up dramatically. Why? Because their pollinators are there. Now the birds are coming. Now other animals are coming, and suddenly we have a more lively ecosystem that we've been able to create. And so if you create those, and there's one of the people that's involved in Hazon does a whole thing on bees, and talks about a bee eruv. How do we create spaces for bees to be able to be safe in our world? This is a great way of doing that. So with a pollinator garden, I also then teach. I'm going to give you two of the lessons that I do, because I don't just plant a pollinator garden saying, oh, look, it's a wonderful garden. I also want it to be, as I said, Jewish story. So here is a Jewish story that I connect to pollinators. So this is the story of Joseph. Joseph has told his brothers and parents about the dream. His brothers are really annoyed by him. And they're off working out in Shechem, but he has been given instructions by Jacob to go and find them. One time when his brothers had gone to pasture their father's flock at Shechem, Israel said to Joseph, your brothers are pasturing at Shechem. Come, I will send you to them. He answered, I'm ready. He said to him, go and see how your brothers are and how the flocks are faring, bring back word. So Joseph goes off. When he reaches Shechem, he comes upon a man wandering as he's wandering the fields. The man asks, sorry about that, I'm scrolling and didn't mean to. What are you looking for? He says, I'm looking for my brothers. Could you tell me where they're pasturing? The man said, they have gone from here. I heard them say, let's go to Dothan. So Joseph followed his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him from afar, and before he came close to them, they conspired to kill him. If you're familiar with the story of Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat, they decide not to kill him. They sell him to slavery. He goes to Egypt. He goes to prison. He gets out of prison. He gets out of prison. He teams up with Pharaoh, saves Egypt, saves the people of Israel, and then we get to the Exodus story. Why this is significant is when he has this interaction with this man, what does the man not ask him? The man never asks for his name. Joseph says to the guy, do you know where my brothers are? And the guy says, yeah, they're over there in Dothan. So our tradition tells us that that guy is an angel, a malach, a messenger, somebody who has been put in a place to make a special connection. How does the guy in the field, this is just the Devar Torah that I found on the internet, giving directions related to Exodus from Egypt. Well, explain that, I retell a Devar Torah I heard from one of the greatest rabbis of our generation, Arlo Guthrie. Guthrie pointed out that Exodus really all leads back to the man standing in the field. Had Joseph given up finding his brothers, just heading back to Jacob, the story of the Jewish people would have been very different. Joseph would have never been sold into slavery by his brothers, never would have gone down to Egypt, never would have brought his family there. Thus, the Jews would have never been enslaved in order to be redeemed. Guthrie says at the concert, it's all due to one man standing in the field saying they went that way. Joseph himself emphasizes that every step was part of God's plan. When his brothers apologized to him for selling them to slavery, he tells them, even though you meant no harm to me, God meant it for good to achieve his present end, the survival of many people. So I'm going to kind of skip a little bit of the commentary there, but the point is that here is this malach floating around. Joseph is floating around. You have this moment of connection. That's what pollinators do. They, in their process, what do? They're going to drink the nectar of the flowers. While they're there, they pick up pollen, and then they go to the next flower and they deliver the pollen. that going back and forth, they are making these connections that are so vital for our world. I have a little bit of cheese over here. Well, I don't have that cheese if all of these pollinator processes aren't going on in our world. And so I often talk about malachim as a great way of illustrating what a malach, that way of connection. You see before you two different stories. These are two of my favorite pollinator stories. And I can actually, sorry, it's in an, I apologize. I will have to send those out. I can't pull it up from the PowerPoint and drop it into the to the chat box. What I can tell you is if you Google Laura Buxton, you can see her name here on Radiolab, you'll pull up this story. And the story of Laura Buxton's absolutely incredible. She is this 9-year-old in England. She writes her name on a card. She attaches it to a helium balloon. She lets the balloon go away. Balloon floats through the air and it comes down in a bush 100 miles away against the prevailing wind. A man walks out, he sees it in the bush, he's about to throw it away, he notices the card. He looks at it, he says, oh, Laura, that Buxton, that's my neighbor. He goes and takes it over to the second Laura Buxton, his neighbor, and gives it to the mom. The mom looks at it and says, Laura, why did you do this? You left trash in our neighbor's yard. The Laura Buxton, the second Laura Buxton, looks at it and says, wait, Mom, this isn't my handwriting. That's not our address. Who is this? And it then reaches out to the first Laura Buxton, who can't believe that her balloon ends up into another Laura Buxton. This is all, by the way, true. The two Laura Buxtons are within a few months of age of each other. And I tell that story as a pollinator story in a very simple way. Think about all of the connections that had to have for that to work. The first Laura Buxton had to release the balloon. The neighbor had to give it to the mom. The mom had to give it to Laura, the second Laura. The second Laura had to reach out to the first Laura. If any one of them had stopped, the chain ends. And there's a second story here, which is called the wallet story. And you can see, there's the Morgan County Seeds. It's just a storytelling site. I found this all over the place. It's a similar story where again and again, different people have to step in and make a conscious act of connection. That's what a pollinator garden is. Where can we see those moments of connection? And here's a little piece from Harold Kushner. The Hebrew word for angel is malach, which also means messenger, one who is sent, unsuspecting and unaware, consumed by their own plans and itinerary. Busy at work on their own schemes, people chose to be messengers of Most High, rarely even know that they are messengers. I don't know how many times in one's life one is also a messenger, but everyone is at least once. And so when I plant a pollinator garden, I'm having all of this in mind, but I'm also then bringing different groups out or being able to show it and be able to teach that kind of lesson. You can also, by the way, do one at high holidays around Rosh Hashanah and be able to do it all about bees. And it's a lot of fun to play with beeswax and bees honey and talk to beekeepers around the time doing something similar or even just focusing on bees and how do we have to take care of bees and how do bees help us learn how to be a meaningful community. So that's the pollinator garden. I wanted to go through one lesson. I have different lessons for each of these concept gardens, but for the sake of time, I wanted to kind of take you through one of the longer versions of my lesson. Here are two other gardens. A chicken soup garden, so a garden that doesn't involve chicken, although you can. If you have chickens, more power to you. My 17-year-old daughter is scared of them, and my wife is not ready for them yet. What you do, what is a chicken soup garden? A garden where you plant the vegetables and herbs that you might add to your chicken soup. Carrots, onions, dill, parsnip, celery, turnips, whatever you put into your chicken soup, that's a whole nother Jewish discussion. And that's the whole point, is you grow stuff. Now, here's the thing. Did I mention that I'm the Job of biblical gardening? I've harvested about 24 tomatoes off of my tomato plants so far this year. When I plant a chicken soup garden, I'm not necessarily planning for all of the vegetables that I might put in my chicken soup. If I grow 2 carrots and I have 1 parsnip and a bunch of dill and maybe half a turnip, I might supplement it from the store, but at least I see the experience and have the experience of growing it. I don't feel like I have to try to feed the whole world or even make a whole dish. If I get a little bit of something from my garden to be able to say, wait, I grew this, and how does that experience change the earth and change me? Then it's, to me, it's powerful and meaningful. Different kind of garden, the pickles. And this is one of the ones, which reminds me, I gotta go burp my pickles. You can grow cucumbers, garlic, mustard, dill, coriander to make wonderful pickles. The garden draws on the experience, Jewish experience from American Jewish experience and the Lower East Side. There's also plenty of other things that get fermented and pickled. Lemons, different sauerkraut. Here are 2 different postings I have. I'm hoping that I didn't freeze for everyone. But so here are just 2 different places talking about how important pickles are and fermented products are in Jewish food culture. And then here is a little piece of Torah too, because the deeper lesson to take from the process of fermentation, indeed, a lesson applicable to every single parsha in the Torah, is internalization. The way fermentation works is that these microorganisms in the air, on the skin, for instance, of cabbage leaves and grapes, are waiting to get inside, to get at the starches and sugars inside, to transform them. When we crush the cabbage leaves and the grapes, we allow those microorganisms access, and they in turn create a whole new product, much more valuable and special than the cabbage and grapes on their own. Yet at the same time, the cabbage and grapes had the spark of potential waiting to be expressed the whole time. In Chassidus, there's an emphasis on taking the external and superficial in our learning and making it real, to internalize it so that it transforms us, affecting us deeply in actuality. So again, it's both the Jewish food culture, what did people put in their chicken soup in what places, but it's also, are there other spiritual lessons that we can teach as we're planting these gardens? I will add also with pickles, they take about 6 or 7 days. So at Motzei Shabbat, I can make a batch of pickles, and then on Friday night, when I'm sitting down with my family, I get to open and taste them for the first time. It's a reminder that it takes work to get ready for Shabbat. All sorts of different ways to layer and weave threads into saying, I'm not just planting a garden, but how do I plant it with Jewish values or with the way of reminding me to take care of the earth? And that would be this here is a pear garden. A lot of community gardens are doing this. I don't have enough resources here to be able to do it, but I know like Mitzvah Garden Kansas City, for example, has this, where it's a pear garden. So they plant a garden that then has produce that goes to a food pantry in the area. This is a little of my one of my square foot gardens. So I think I've got some squash and some beans and some corn. This is from about 6 or 7 years ago. I'm still using these boxes, but I have new stuff planted in them. And this is about sharing and experiencing food justice. Karpas and Maror Garden. This is one of the things I mentioned earlier. So this is around Tu B'Shvat for us in Florida. You also, I think up north, could start some of these things or do these things inside or in a greenhouse, but plant some of the herbs, whether the herbs of your area or the herbs that might have been in Europe or might have been in Israel. What does it mean to have different sweet and bitter herbs that you get to enjoy? And so this was some arugula, and you can see some parsley and cilantro. This is me just experimenting with all kinds of different things. These are actually olas, which are ceramic vessels that you put into the soil. You put the water into the vessel, it's unglazed, and then it wicks out into the garden. This is my 5 Senses garden. This is an earlier iteration of it where we planted it as a spiral because it was a lot of fun to kind of try to design that. This is a later iteration of it. To the right is a later one where the spirals started to fall in. So I've now opened it up, and I've now got a larger planting. But the 5 Senses gardens are different stories like Bilam or Jacob waking up to God's presence. And so I have herbs in there that we use for Havdalah. I've grown cotton in there that you can use for dream pillows, and that we use for the wicks of our olive oil lamps that we use on Friday night. Just different kinds of things. So we have our kids from our religious school that go to experiment with, that go to experience the five senses. We use some of the produce that comes from this in our groggers for Purim. And so it's just a way of planting to be able to say, how am I planting in a way that touches all five of my senses? Great experience. There was stevia growing in one of these gardens at one point. I went out I picked some, and I went and I had mint, and I took the stevia and I smelled it. I'm like, it doesn't smell. You then take a bite of it and it's super sweet. It's a reminder that some of the plants have smell and no taste, and others have no smell and a lot of taste. A Three Sisters garden. So you might have heard this. Native Americans plant squash, corn, and beans together as a way of creating a unit. You can do this in a garden that you have as a way of saying, wait, what were the corn, squash, and beans, and how did they plant them in my area? Or when the Native Americans were planting the Three Sisters here, where was my family and what were they planting, and can I do that here? It's also a good way to learn about the environment. What are the native plants, and what places were they planted, and how was that native produce used? I'll highly recommend a podcast called Gastropod. Gastropod is really incredible. There's a beautiful episode they have on Native American plants and Native American food. They also have one on sourdough, and the history of the bagel that they offer is amazing. They actually have from 13th century Polish, 13th or might be 15th, Polish writings about how to serve bagels at a bris. You can also do a 7-species garden, and I will freely admit this is easier because my weather, the rain is the opposite of Israel, but the temperatures are the same. So I can grow pomegranates, I can grow date palms, I can grow olives, I can grow all of the grapes, the figs, the pomegranates, the olive trees, the dates, the wheat and barley. I can actually grow all of that here. But even if you just grow one, or even if you just have it in a pot, or even if you just find a pygmy variety, just to have that sense of Israel, that little bit of an experience of it. Our olive trees have never produced, but just having them there reminds us to take care of them and think about what does it mean to have olive trees. We've been able to get figs here, but then you bring in some more figs to taste, even if you aren't able to grow, but just seeing the fig leaves is absolutely incredible. Chametz, kitniot, and matzah. So again, a chance to play with that concept of chametz. There's all kinds of different teachings around what chametz is. Chametz is the leavening agents that we're supposed to not have at Passover. And so that's a great chance to play with sourdough before Passover and after Passover, and then not use it during Passover. But you can grow some of the grains of chametz, wheat and barley, oats and rye and spelt, or you can grow some of the kitniot, the things that were not available to our ancestors, to be able to say, what are some of these alternative different grains? This is actually matzah that I grew, that I made. So I do make sourdough bread. I've only been doing it for a couple of months, but I gave away my chametz. I gave away my sourdough starter at the beginning of Passover, and right as Passover was about to begin, I used the last of my flour to make some matzah that I used during the week. Okay, I'll be honest, it lasted 2 days. But that was, again, another way of experiencing Passover, of thinking about what was my baking like before, and then what was my baking like after. An Israeli street food garden. And so you can grow eggplants and cucumbers and tomatoes and different things that might be in Israeli salad, or put in a pita bread. On the right, this is one of my new crazy creations. I started with potato towers. I didn't have a lot of success. So I said, let me start doing chickpea towers. So I got a bag of chickpeas at the store and I put them into my germination station. And I made a little tower of fencing, and then I'm just planting it, and I'll actually fill it up in a few days and be able to see if I can grow some chickpeas. I might get 3 chickpeas out of this experience. I might get enough to make 1 can of or 1 bowl of hummus. I just don't know. But if I don't, but by trying it and experiencing it, I give myself a taste. I say that not trying to pun, but succeeding in punning. A taste of what goes into every time we buy. How many of us buy hummus? What an awesome chance to see how many plants it takes to get enough chickpeas for a cup of chickpeas. So chickpeas, garlic, marjoram, hyssop, eggplant, peppers, tomatoes, there's all kinds of different things. And again, if you're then growing them, you get to play with all of those great cookbooks and recipes that are coming out of Israel. A Simis garden. This is a slow cook garden. So what are the things that we can grow that we then use for slow cook recipes? This is a reference to that story with Jacob and Esau, but also for Shabbat. Strong tradition of taking something, slow cooking it, beginning, your challah comes out on Friday, you put into your hot oven your cholent or your tzimis, let it go until Saturday afternoon and enjoy it. What are some of the things you can grow that you can then enjoy in a slow cook fashion that give you a chance to experiment, to play, to take out some of those different cookbooks? A little red hen garden. And so this was growing a little bit of wheat. I actually then get decorative wheat from a company. We thresh it, we winnow it, we grind it, and then you can make matzah or make bread out of it. And I'm supplementing each way along the way, but here's the wheat growing. This is just before the squirrels got it. And this is my son, and he might have been 7 or 8. He's now 14 and 6'1" or 6'2". He doesn't weigh much more than this now. And there were other pictures with me in a boot, which that was quite a while ago. But you can see we crushed the wheat. We blew air into it, and the stuff goes everywhere. It's actually a lot of fun to do. And then we were just crushing some of it here. I've now got a grinder to crush it up. But just that experience of doing it, I've done it with adults, and I've done it with kids. It is incredible to stop and grow, thresh, winnow, and grind, and then bake with it. We eat bread, or we eat food products. We don't even realize what goes into what we've been able to experience. Here's a grogger or rhythm garden. And so you can grow beans and seeds. You can, if there's bamboo around, there's all kinds of gourds. This is one of my latest experiments. You can grow the upside down planter things that you can get. They're all over Amazon and other places. I didn't have pepper plants to put in. This one was supposed to be designed for pepper plants. I put bean seeds in it. It's growing happily. So I was able to hang it on a shepherd's hook, and it's now stood over the garden. And actually there are some cucumbers down below. And you can see this is my, in the back is it used to be the pool deck at our synagogue. We have a house that's part of our office. There is a pool, formerly a pool deck. There's no pool there now, but you can see in the background, those are some of my garden experiments. That's where I have my etrog starts growing. But you don't need a lot of space to have a shepherd's hook, have one bag. How awesome it would be to take a grogger that you've grown instead of one of those little plastic and metal things. I take, if I finish a container of mints, I harvest the beans, I put them in the mint container that I would have otherwise thrown away, and now I've got a grogger that I get to use for Purim. Just trying to find ways, how do I think about the rituals that I do? What are things from the garden I can bring in for those rituals? And what are the food products that are part of our rituals that I can find in the garden to understand that experience? A Dor Vador garden. This is me. You can't see my foot because I had to have, because that was when I was in the boot for a broken bone, and pre-beard here, and much less gray. So this is about 5 or 6 years ago. What am I eating? I'm eating a melon. And so I actually use it to talk about the melon balls of time. I eat the melon. We save the innards. I'm planting the seeds, and then the innards that we didn't plant went in the compost. And so I'm showing, here's the past, here's the present, and there's the future. And so the past is the waste that I'm composting. The present is the melon I get to eat. And then I'm taking the seeds and we planted them in the garden to see what would grow. And so avocados, potatoes, onions, leeks, garlic, there's all kinds of different stuff that you can take and start growing again in your garden. And it's a way of door. How do we keep the generations growing, thinking differently about the waste that we have and different ways about sustainability? And that is the end, and I'm sure I will have more ideas of different garden concepts. I am happy to take questions or thoughts or feedback. Thank you for letting me share that with you.